Right. So the next series of recommendations deal with commercial accommodation, and there were a number of questions posed in the survey, and I'll try to summarize all of them. I guess as a general comment, many, if not all, of what was suggested in the draft plan is supported by the folks that responded. However, some of the questions were a little too complicated, if I can put it that way, for folks to really understand what the question was, but I'll leave that aside. So I'll just go through this particular section, section I. And basically the intent of the revised policies, as we all know, because we've talked about them for quite a bit, is to really ensure that hotels and motels and others particularly resorts, are planned from the outset and continue to be commercial in nature and available to the traveling public to continue attracting visitors to the area. And then we posed a number of questions along those lines. So question 19 in the survey was, so we basically asked whether, sorry, let me back up. So the draft official plan proposed to permit resort commercial accommodation uses on resort properties outside of the urban centers, provided each unit generates turnover of occupants through mandatory rental pools, programs, exchanges, time sharing, and so on. And it goes on to indicate that the owner can only use a unit for a maximum of 26 weeks in the calendar year and a maximum of 4 weeks in July and August. And those are basically the same restrictions we put in place through the Minette process. So we're basically carrying that forward and making that a township-wide policy outside, again, of the urban centers. In response to the questions, 63% said yes, 37% no. And while most of the respondents said they support it, a number still had concerns about the policy being too permissive, and others still had concerns about the policy continuing to encourage higher density developments on the township's lakes. Other respondents didn't really understand the rationale led to the policy and felt that they had to vote yes or no, but they were concerned about it being unenforceable. Enforceability is definitely a challenge. We have a lot of, we have a good understanding of that. But in the end of the day, I continue to recommend that including a detailed set of restrictions on occupancy is necessary to provide clarity on the township's expectations, and this policy should be carried forward into the next draft of the official plan. I'm also aware that a few comments were made by Federation of Muskoka or MLA or both, I can't recall, that looked to strengthen some of that wording along the lines of what we did with the Minette official plan amendment, because that came afterwards, and those make sense. So we will be doing that to the best of our abilities to make sure that the policies of Minette and the policies outside of Minette as it relates to this issue are as aligned as possible going forward. So that's my recommendation on the issue of turnover.
Okay, thank you. Welcome back, Councillor Mazan. Okay, do I have any comments from anyone? Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you. Actually, I support this recommendation, but I believe there's two other things that haven't been dealt with, and I'm not sure, Chair, if they belong in this item. I couldn't find another item. As you know, commercial resorts are a very important part of our OP, and there are two issues that haven't been dealt with, and one is density, and the other is lot in siting. And I wondered if I might address them in this point, or do you prefer that they come in at a later point in this discussion?
All right, just let me ask you, Councillor Jaglowitz, are you talking about what's in our Minette OPA in terms of those references, and they're not here? Is that what you're referring to?
When we talk about density, I'm talking about one part of it's in the Minette and one part of it's in Seguin's bylaw. When I talk about lot inciting, they're provisions that are in our current official plan that for some reason didn't get carried forward into this one.
So I think that's a question for Mr. McDonald.
Yeah, I think I understand where you're going, Councillor. And there are provisions that establish minimum frontages and minimum areas for new resorts, and we did not carry that forward. I think there is merit in actually doing that. and considering an increase in size as appropriate. And that's something Mr. Pink and myself will talk about. So something like that, I think, makes some sense. In terms of the siting and location, I'm not sure what you're getting at, Councillor. So perhaps you can expand on that point, and I can consider it.
Yes. Well, they're in the existing official plan. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting myself mixed up. You're agreeing with the frontage and area definition, yes. that part. The density part, the first part that's in Seguin is they limit the accommodation units to one for every 6 meters of frontage, or one for every 20 feet. And then the Manette bylaw talks about the size of that unit. In other words, that it's not just a room or it's like an 850 square foot cottage. So putting those together, they have a limit on some upper limit on that. And as I say, one was in the Seguin bylaw, and the second part was in the Manette. So you've already agreed to carry the Manette part forward, which is the definition of 850 square feet. The other is then having some idea of what density might be expected. And that particular one is 10 units per hectare or 4 units per acre. And then based on frontage, one every 6 meters or 20 feet.
And those are fair comments. And actually, Mr. Pink and I have been having conversations on and off about that moving forward in terms of how we can do that in the new official plan as it relates to this issue. There's also an issue in terms of how density is calculated and whether it only applies to the front portion of the property near the waterfront, or it extends as far back as it can. So those, I guess I can't give you an answer right now in terms of what it'll look like, but I agree in principle that those are good ideas that should be in the official plan. Mr. Pink, any additional comments on that?
Mr. Pink?
Thank you, Chair. I think just wanted to agree that yes, those policies need to be carried forward, but I think rather than, and Mr. McDonald and I can go through the details and come back with something, but rather than the segment approach or what we do in our settlement areas, which is a unit cap per acreage, what our current official plan policy state and our zoning bylaw, we have a sort of a categorization of resorts into 4 different zoning categories, and we limit gross floor area depending on which category you're in. So ranging from very remote small resorts on small lakes to the very large, and it will be a gradient. And we find that gross floor area limitation is much more restrictive than a unit count. The unit count we use in our settlement areas, and we've heard some comments about the extent of development allowed there, and that seems to be the approach Seguin is taking. So, but to summarize, we don't necessarily have to hash out those details right here. I think the clear message, and we've agreed, is we will look at the existing policies and make sure that the appropriate ones are carried forward with respect to density, lot and site requirements, unit sizes, etc.
Then one quick supplementary. I'm pleased with that response. I would hope, though, that looking at the resorts that were in Manette, I hope the gross square footage doesn't give the number of units that on the one resort that's being developed there, as you recall, it didn't define what a unit was. Do you know what I mean? Or square footage, and it has much more development rights. Anyway, I'm choking on my words. Let me say, I'm hopeful that you will approach the densities more similar to what was done in the Manette rather than what's in her current. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? I think 4,000 units on that one property is very, very, very excessive. I hope that's not what our new OP is going to say.
No, absolutely not. I mean, Manette is a special policy area. It has its own set of policies and the densities that come along with it. Quite frankly, I don't anticipate anything like that anywhere else in the township. I just don't see it. So the density policy, while we may use some of Minette's policies, such as unit count, the turnover stuff, and so on, the density will be different than Minette and less than Minette, obviously.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any further comments, so are we in agreement that we'll move ahead with this direction, and Mr. McDonald and Mr. Pink will bring back a little more detail on what we talked about today? So we're all good with that?
Great.
Okay, Mr.
Okay, so the next one is question 21. So the draft plan proposed to support development of single owner accommodation uses and discourage the development of commercial accommodation by plan of condominium outside of the urban centers. And again, survey participants were asked whether they support this approach. 79% yes, 21% no. I continue to believe that this is the right direction for the township to take with this type of development. And I recommend that this direction be carried forward into the next draft of the official plan.
Any comments, committee? I think we're all good with that, Mr. McDonald. So
Great.
Let's move on.
Okay, question 23, and I think this will be simple too. The draft also proposed to require that a variety of substantive resort-related amenities and services be available on site, and then in-person management be available as well. Again, survey respondents were asked whether they support this approach, and it was 86% yes and 14% said no. So I continue to believe this is a good approach for the township to take. It was directed to be added by planning committee in the past, and it has been added. And I continue to believe it's the right approach. So no changes suggested.
Okay, committee, any comments? Oh, I think that means agreement. So let's move on.
Okay, questions 25 and 26 dealt with the downzoning of resort properties. Currently, they're identified as employment lands and can only be changed through a comprehensive review, which means anytime the official plan is updated. We're proposing to take that restriction away and allow for the downzoning of properties provided appropriate justifications is submitted for consideration, and also provided that the alternative use makes sense and certainly not at the densities that existed with the previous use. We then asked whether the proposed criteria we identified were appropriate, and in terms of whether downzoning was a good idea or supported, 76% said yes, 24% said no. And with respect to the criteria, probably a difficult question to ask in a survey format, but 61% said yes and 39% said no, but many who responded to that particular question didn't have the criteria in front of them, so they weren't really able to comment on it. So I think going forward that the approach we're taking is the right one. I do, however, think that additional clarity is needed in what we've come up with to make it as clear as possible what the township's expectations are. So with that in mind, my recommendation is that they be carried forward and that they be refined to provide the additional clarity that is needed. That's recommendation 12.
Okay, committee, any comments? Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sure you all have heard me express this opinion before, and I may be alone in this, but I believe these are employment lands. I believe if we allow them to be downzoned, we'll never get them back. However, there are issues with some of them, and maybe downzoning is appropriate in some cases, but it should not be taken lightly. So if this is going to get enacted, I think it has to be worded in such a way that downzoning is the last resort, and that all avenues to protect these as employment lands be tried. I know it sounds simple to take a place like a camp that may be a large piece of property that has a potential zoning and to take it and downzone it into several residential lots. But that takes that piece of property that exists here that has been used for years. I'm not talking about a particular one, but and we no longer will be able to have that type of use on the lake. So So I think it has to be taken very seriously. I know a lot of people don't support me on this, but I still have to express it. I think resorts in that activity is a very important part of our township, and they should be protected at all costs. There are times when they fall out of favor, but interesting enough, with the pandemic, more people came up here. So anyway, those are my thoughts. So I'm not opposed to what's going out. I just think there should be a lot of care given to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you. And through you, I'm going to support Councillor Jagowitz's sentiment. These are employment lands. The ability to downzone should be a big challenge. And I frankly don't understand why we're proposing to take it from where it is now, where it has to be part of a comprehensive review and lessen the burden at all.
Okay, so help me understand that, Councillor Kelly. We can't downzone right now. Can't. So.
Right. But I don't think we can look at employment lands in isolation and make a decision to change the character or lose the value of them as employment lands unless it's in conjunction with a bigger review of the and a comprehensive review of the official plan, unless it's part of a bigger picture. I think if we make it too easy on an individual property basis, we're going to lose them and regret it down the road.
Thank you. I understand that better now. Thank you. Mayor Harding?
I think this new policy is in the right direction. As much as we call these employment lands, they are no longer employment lands. We have one or two big resorts that will support employment lands, and we have a number of commercial properties that are actually probably being operated more as private residences and cottages and should be continued as private residences and cottages and allowed to be downzoned with lesser densities allowed on the properties. Our economy has changed drastically from a resort-based, tourism-based economy that we saw in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, or even the 80s, to where we are at today. We create a problem. We want employment lands, but nobody wants to have the staff live in towns. And many of these small resort commercial properties don't have space to have and house their own staff. And if somebody wants to come to us, we've heard time and time again, some of these small resorts can't afford to be a small resort. They want to be condominiumized because they have to sell them to people, because renting hotel rooms as a resort doesn't financially work anymore. And yet we're taking away a lot of that because it can't be condominiumized. We are creating these properties not to become economically successful in any way, shape, or form. And in fairness, I would rather see a spade called a spade. And if we have a resort commercial property, I'll take Mattamy Homes property on Ferndale Road. It does some corporate stuff. It's a corporate property, but it should truly be downzoned to a residence at this particular time. And we would stop all development. We wouldn't have 5 boathouses on the property because it's still under a commercial zone. So I'm totally in favor of this policy going forward. And again, for those who don't know, my background was running and managing resort waterfronts across this province. So I've seen a lot of my old hotels no longer in business because the economy has changed. And I don't see it coming back anytime soon. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question. Is this grandfathered? Or if this goes through, do we look at those properties that are now running as personal residences on commercial land, and are we going to make them downzone? I assumed this would be grandfathered because, okay. Mr. McDonald?
Yeah, so the policy is future looking, of course. So it's trying to anticipate circumstances in the future where someone doesn't want to operate the property as a commercial property, wants to convert to something else. In terms of how the existing properties are zoned and dealt with, that's a great question. That's not really an OP question. It's more of a zoning bylaw implementation question. And Dave and I have had a few conversations about, well, what happens if the direction of the township is to really discourage, resort development by condominium? What does that really mean for the existing properties? And maybe their zoning should be changed. The question is, who initiates that? Should that be the private property owner, or should that be the township? So that's a broad discussion, perhaps for another day. But to address the comment about whether these should be employment lands and only looked at every 5 years, personally, I don't really see what the benefit of that would be, particularly if there is no alternative use. The idea behind not permitting the consideration of conversions, in 5 or 10 year increments, is because you hope that an alternative use would come in, buy the land, and use it. But if it's clear that that's just not possible, it doesn't seem fair to me to ask that person to wait 5 or 10 years to make an application or make a request to convert to something else. The property goes into disrepair during that time. It may become a blight on the landscape. So I'm not sure there's any benefit. And I'm thinking that the policies we've come up with are pretty rigorous and onerous. And in the end, council will have to make a decision on whether it makes sense to convert to another use based on the evidence that's being provided. And if they've done not a very good job in doing that justification, you're in your rights to say, no, it doesn't make sense. And I think that's the most proper approach and fair to those folks who want to proceed in downzone.
Okay, thank you. I was just thinking of people listening in who may be on those properties and wondering if the grandfathering would be in effect, but we normally grandfather when we do something new like this. Okay, I don't see any more comments. Do we have everybody in favor of moving this out as the recommendation stands? Okay. All right, so I believe we're down to your last recommendation, Mr. McDonald. And you're on mute, Mr. McDonald.
Sorry about that. Yeah, and just after that, we did have another question in the survey dealing with the sharing economy. It doesn't have an OP related, I guess, impact, but we did ask the question. Both David and I thought it would make sense if we did, just to get a gauge of what folks are thinking about licensing and so on. So we asked whether it would make sense for the township to explore regulatory options to regulate this use. And 67% said yes, and 33% said no. So that doesn't result in any changes to the OP, but I just wanted to mention that. The next one deals with rural